Hi everyone, my name is Laura and my presentation today is going to highlight how María Teresa León's work uses voice as a site of resistance through a reading of an excerpt from my ongoing translation of her memoir titled Memory of Melancholy. This translation is a central part of my practice-based PhD research. If you want to read along, you can scan the QR code on the screen right now to access the excerpt, including some bits I've had to cut for the sake of time, as well as the Spanish version. I've also brought a few paper copies of the passage in case you don't have a device or just prefer paper. I'll give you a few seconds now, but this code will be on the screen during the reading, so if you miss it, it's fine. María Teresa León was a highly regarded, if somewhat forgotten today, author and activist. She was a communist and Republican militant during the Spanish Civil War, and her political and cultural work continued during the 28 years she spent in exile following Franco's rise to power. Her father was an army colonel with a tendency towards boredom, which led the family to relocate multiple times during León's childhood. Rather than being a result of war and exile, lack of permanence and the transitional nature of León's homes are characteristic features of her entire life. The feelings of loss and melancholy, which gives name to the memoir, are present throughout, including the many passages dedicated to her childhood. Despite its melancholic nature, resistance is also apparent throughout. León displays and encourages resistance towards the rise of fascism that she was witnessing throughout Europe, resistance to the destruction and censorship of culture, and resistance to the patriarchal society that attempted to control her, limited her access to education, and that had separated her from her sons when she divorced her first husband. Memory of Melancholy is an extensive memoir that covers over 60 years of León's life. There are many sites of resistance to different issues, from the church to the patriarchal violence she had experienced, or even the US involvement in the Vietnam War, to name a few. I found the excerpt I've brought today, which I've nicknamed Niebla, particularly emotive, provocative, and honestly hard to read, which is why I've added the content warnings. I've become really interested in figuring out how León created such effective storytelling and trying to reproduce it in my translation into English. León uses little snippets from her life, told in a non-linear way that can at times be ambiguous and leave the reader feeling a bit lost about what's happening or who's talking. But that's part of the reason why it creates such a strong response from the reader. The passage I've brought today, The passage I've brought today is situated relatively early in the memoir, and it tells the story of León's dog, Niebla. Niebla means fog, but I've decided to leave this word untranslated as it's a name. I'm going to read the first couple sentences in Spanish, so you can get a feeling of the rhythm and the sound. Aquel perro era la estampa de la gratitud. Agradecía que le hubiésemos abierto la puerta y, después de recibirle con Neruda, hubiésemos acogido a aquel perro peludo y serio que llegaba con la pata partida. Le llamamos Niebla. Venía de la niebla, de una de esas noches españolas de disparos y angustia. There is the code again. Okay, so now the English, and hopefully I've done her justice. That dog was the poster child of gratitude. She was thankful Neruda and I had opened the door, and after welcoming her in, we had taken in that hairy and serious friend who arrived with a broken leg. We call her Niebla. She came from the fog on one of those nights of gunfire and anguish. They weren't days of war yet, but Rafael had already received death threats, and there had already been attacks against some politicians, amongst them Dr. Luis Jiménez de Asúa. We accepted the dog like an injured comrade for whom we had to throw a net of the seat for protection if they come knocking for them. When that small hunched vet put his hand on her leg, she was in so much pain. If anyone ever asked her what she had in her soul, she would say tears, tears. With this thought, she walks next to the stranger who had wanted to escort her, and she wonders how far she can trust this boy. She's been alone for so long, she no longer needs company. I've lost my line. Okay. What point is there to this young man walking beside her? Sorry. What's a man good for alongside a woman? They've not been much good for her. Her soul has been scratched by the mauling claws of some men. It's in shreds. What point is there to this young man walking beside her betrayed youth? But he listens to her, and they continue talking quietly, shaking the minutes of their shoulders so as not to pass their passing, so as not to feel their passing. They are two silhouettes under the acacias on the street where there's nobody, nobody, nobody. She doesn't remember now if daylight had already crept up on them before they looked at each other, bedraggled and radiant and parting ways. Later, much later, they would greet each other at a door that would slam between them, cutting their hands as it closed. The dog was a living marvel for us, finally a creature that wasn't static and immobile in our home. Her name was Niebla. A poet's hand had brought her to us in the night's fog, injured by an army lorry full of assault guards. Wasn't that what they told you, Pablo? Poor thing, another of repression's victims. How beautiful the little eyes peeking out of all that wool. I have her here with me, right now, right beneath my hand. Niebla, you don't understand. No, you don't understand our affection. It comes from so far away, and we give it to each dog that comes into our lives. Oh, how you limped. You showed us your leg, whimpering to soften us up, so we would scratch your pale, shaggy chrysanthemum of a head. How much you loved us, how much we loved you. Niebla's story is like ours. She stayed at our side when the first gunshot rings on the 18th of July, 1936. We are on the island of Ibiza. In Madrid, they said the Francoists had executed us there. My mother, distraught and without any news, gave Niebla to the binman. The dog must have talked to him about us constantly. Poor thing. Yes, she gave her away. When we returned, Niebla didn't come out to welcome us. I saw my mother's pale face. Did Niebla die? No, but the binman, he asked for her, you know, and now he doesn't want to give her back unless you recommend him to the communist youth. And so we did. And one morning, the young man knocked on the door. He had Niebla. How much darker she was. She came to us dirty and ragged underneath poor binman's guard. But she forgave us. She forgave everything. And we kissed her dirty, smelly head, explained to her with a sigh, Niebla, is the war. Then Niebla saw war at close hand. With the roar of artillery in the distance, El Palacio del Prado welcomed the officials of the international brigades. There we went to live. One day, Niebla cornered a deer running away from the bombs. Niebla was beside Rafael on the day a stray bullet hit the trunk of a tree at the level of his head while he was writing verses for the rabbit mouths of combatants. Then it was so hard to eat. She was taken far from the besieged city, closer to the sea. My mother, my grandmother, and my aunt Concha and the two maids, Meli and Victorina, who always accompanied them, settled in Castellón de la Plana. There, in a garden near the Mediterranean, Niebla was queen. Tired of hearing them complain about how little they ate, she stole a big piece of meat from who knows where, depositing it at my mother's feet. Here, silly, and you always saying there's nothing to eat. Niebla, Niebla, mirror of virtues, vigilant affection, and pure love. How badly humans must have looked in your heaven of happiness. Yes, Niebla, yes, but men destroyed and killed each other right at the edge of the flower garden you guarded. The war charged against the sea, lifted the tables and pulled the tablecloths and spilled the salt and the oil and the sugar. The war scattered the children playing and the women preparing lunch. Those singing by the fountain ran away. All the things you would have never done, they did, sinking their teeth into flesh, tearing it away. That's when it happened, that thing you've already forgotten. It surprised you, seeing all the women rushing from the house. They're going on a trip, you thought. They'll take me along. But no, they were abandoning you, choosing life, escaping death. A lorry arrived. Terrified women piled into it, and you ran after them with all your wonderful youth, your happiness, your strength, because you thought they were asking you to play. More, just a little bit more, Niebla. The air choked you. You panted. Resist. It's so hard running after a lorry on a road where everything runs away. Resist. How can we help you when children are left behind and a mother screams that, in her panic, she's forgotten the littlest one in bed? Resist. Cries and laments boiling over. You run, you pant. Resist. That's what they're asking of the poor Spanish people. Resist. But how? I don't know, Niebla, in what moment your little legs buckled, sending you sprawling by the side of the road, with your tongue hanging out red as a carnation. Humans, you must have thought bleakly as you shrank in your silvery skin, disheartened by humans forever after. Okay, cool. So, what can we make out of this, other than it was quite hard to translate, and the first couple of times I cried a little bit. In this excerpt, in this excerpt, Niebla is first a comrade they have to protect, and then she becomes a symbol of a nation's resistance to Franco's forces in a violent war that separated families and divided towns. And in my opinion, the ending of Niebla's story symbolizes the eventual defeat of the Republican side as Niebla struggles and fails to keep up with the lorry, to end up abandoned by the side of the road. While the central focus of this excerpt is Niebla, it is interrupted with snippets from other memories. The second paragraph, for example, appears to have nothing to do with Niebla. There is no sign of how the two stories are connected. And that pretty much happens throughout the memoir. There are no chapters, very much non-linear, so it's fun. In it, she seems to reflect on the disappointing and at times harmful role men have played in her life. Then we are suddenly thrown into León's memories of Niebla and the early months of the Spanish Civil War once again. One of the reasons why Niebla's story is so gut-wrenching is her innocence. In a story of war, it's easy to become accustomed to death and suffering. But the fact that the focus here is in an innocent dog instead is what makes it so effective at dodging the reader's defenses. To conclude, Memory of Melancholy and León's voice are characterized by a strong sense of loss, but also resistance, something I've started thinking of as a melancholic resistance. It's her own and Spain's resistance, as well as the resistance across Europe to the rise of fascism. And I just said the word resistance many times. Thank you for listening.
Put the mic over here. Right. Good morning, everyone. So, yes, welcome to this session called Undoing the Silence, Life Writing on Race. So a little bit about me. As Amir said, I am a Yoruba Nigerian, so that's from the southwest of Nigeria. I'm a lecturer, workshop facilitator, memoir polemic writer, and a poet with work published in anthologies. Something happened with UNESCO, I'm not quite sure. I do lots of various empowerment projects, including What Color Are Your Senses, which is about intercultural intelligence. I also write articles for Yoruba Yonder, through which I also derive the Unad Talks lecture series, as well as the Scottish Racism Project too. Does it want to work? Yay, it's working. So yes, I have appeared at various different conferences, so hopefully I know what I'm doing. We shall see, but that's about me. How about yourselves? What will you gain from this particular session, and how will it expand your knowledge base? Well, hopefully, it'll give you an idea about writing inspirations and what inspires writers to do what they do, as well as their journeys on their way to writing their work. We're going to look at subject and indeed audience trepidation that can affect the writer and what they're trying to convey. And then hopefully we'll just throw that all out and just go with expressive freedom. That's, yay. I got a yay there, lovely. Okay, let's start as we mean to go on. First, I'm going to look at memoir polemics on race in general. Then I'm going to look at muffled foundations before undoing that muffledness, undoing the silence. It's going to be an interactive session, so please do participate as we go on. So first, looking at those memoir polemics. Another word for memoir polemic is autoethnography. And I wonder, can anyone tell us what autoethnography means? What it's all about? No? Someone? Hazard a guess? Yes?
It's an ethnography on a culture that involves oneself. And so you look not just at a subject group outside of yourself, but within your own culture as well.
Absolutely. Great stuff, yes. So a breakdown, a little bit more of a breakdown. It's an autobiographical genre of academic writing which draws on and analyzes or interprets the lived experience of the author and connects researcher insights into self-identity, cultural rules, resources, communication practices, traditions, premises, symbols, rules, shared meaning, emotions, values, larger social, cultural, and political issues too. So yes, it intersects with memoir polemics in that way. And there's lots of race-related examples of this. One would be, quite famous there, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Eder-Lodge. We've also got British, Race, Identity and Belonging by Afua Hirsch. And of course, we have Akala with Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, all of which are top bestsellers upon release. So, it also includes my upcoming memoir polemic series, which is called Stained Glass Eyes, Memoirs on Race, Family, and Multiculturalism. Now, all of this will be mixing cultural hopping narratives between Nigeria, Scotland, and Japan. And it's going to be mixing together factual insights into sociology, psychology, anthropology, linguistics, history, etc., etc. That's essential. It's essential considering the context of my particular life journey, which is so, intercontinental. That was a new word, intercontinental? What does that mean? Last time I checked, it might be intercontinental. Well, you know, we writers, we like to make up noise. Anywho, it's unique. It's unique in that it's straight-laced auto-ethnographical writing meeting creative non-fiction prose. Okay. So, there we go. So, it's been a long time in the making, this project, Stained Glass Eyes. Initially was going to be just one book with 9 chapters, but with a childhood spanning, 3 continents, it stretched into a 3-part memoir series. Now, the first book, there's actually a little description of the first book that I've left on some of the chairs here. It's looking at primary school years in Nigeria and Scotland, followed by my secondary school years in Scotland and Japan, and that's where I derived the What Colour Are Your Senses project, about intercultural intelligence. And then it looks at university here in England, then in France, followed by, oh, hello, that's fun. Why did that happen? There we go. Followed by the global career in lecturing, examining, etc., etc. So there's a lot of content in there to get through. So, with Africa, Europe, and Asia on one childhood, there does need to be a lot of sociological theory to contextualize such a diverse upbringing, including sociology, school and wider communities, psychology, skewered child development stages, as you can imagine, anthropology, with regards to different cultural nuances for behavioral norms, linguistics for different conceptual variations, as well as history, with regards to limited outlooks, right? So all this kind of polemic, journalistic, academic writing is mixed with life stories. And just like other life writers on race, it's been, as I say, quite a journey, bringing my racist experiences to the fore. And why is that? Well, because of muffled foundations. Yes? Let's look at some of those muffled foundations now. Basically, I was conditioned to silence, yes, from a very, very young age. Can anyone tell me which UK region has the highest race-related murder rate? Any guesses? That's one guess. Any other guesses? It was an accurate guess. It's Scotland in general. But Glasgow specifically, for almost, 120 years, has had the highest murder rate in the entire continent of Europe. Right? So square that as well with having the highest race-related murder rate in the UK. Well, what's going to happen? Well, with my Nigerian family, our lives of attempted murders and with attempted arsons, attempted stabbings, that was not conversation for my primary school classmates who just wanted to talk about cartoons and toys and birthday parties. Yay! Yeah, they didn't want to hear about the stabbings. So my mode of solitary racial expression, therefore, initially became poetry. Yes? And this is quite odd that the computer is doing funny things like that. Will it behave itself? Oh no. Okay, let's see. Right, it seems to behave itself now. Lovely. So as I say, my mode of solitary racial expression initially became poetry, and I continued dealing with race in poetic isolation throughout my secondary school years as well, navigating the constant verbal attacks, mental attacks, and physical attacks through that medium. So, it started initially with either racism or xenophobia, experience at school being actively silenced by pupils walking away from any mention of racism in conversation, actively silenced by teachers quashing any complaints about racist behavior from pupils or indeed from themselves or the teachers. And that phenomenon is mentioned in Akala's Natives and his memoir Polemic too. And it was also passively silenced by family who were going through their own strives with racial abuse and not wanting to pile onto them extra with my own stuff going on. That silencing, that kind of conditioning was so ingrained that when I shifted my school community to the other side of the world, my Japanese school community, I didn't mention the years of Scottish racism that I'd endured, and instead actually became a tourist rep for Scotland. Yay, come visit this place that tried to burn me alive, aged 8. It's wonderful, have a great time. Really though? What's going on there? Right. I think it is unfair. This is very true. And it's something which I was still dealing with when I got to university. University in England, being my first experience dealing with race and poetic community through various African and Caribbean society events. That was fun. It was also that time, mind you, I began diverging from poetry to process racial bigotry, this time focusing more on academia, on my studies, to bridge that knowledge gap regarding racism's existence and racism's execution, you know? So, yeah, that gagged childhood left many questions unanswered, as I'm sure you can imagine. So higher education, it was wonderful. It was very enlightening in some areas, many of the areas I mentioned before, which I've now interlaced into the storytelling, my memoir polemic. However, it's doing the fun thing again, isn't it? Why is it doing that? So it also evoked even more questions, yes, than it actually answered for me, right? So that's a phenomenon also mentioned in Afua Hirsch's book, British. So from muffled foundations, now let's go to undoing the muffling, undoing the silence. And that's something that I started thinking about after graduation. But truth be told, that demographic shift from being with the African Caribbean Society at university to majority white workplaces, well, suddenly I was yet again less confident voicing such themes on race. But hearing too many stories, way too many stories of racial bigotry from global majority colleagues and friends overlapping with my own, yeah, I became driven by a different assertion, this assertion over here. If there is one lesson we can learn from the struggle against racism in our country as well as yours, is it that racism must be concisely combated and not discreetly tolerated. I wonder, can anyone tell me who said that quote? Any ideas? Who might have said that? Who thinks it was Boris Johnson? I'm so happy you laughed. It wasn't him. Who's this guy? It was indeed Nelson Mandela, Madiba, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Yes, so this assertion actually aligns with critical race theory, at least the concept of interest convergence within critical race theory, which involves countering post-racial and racist narratives with our voices, voices of the global majority experiencing racism. So these counter-narratives are speaking truth to power, yes? So when I dare to be powerful, it makes sense to put it in there, doesn't it? Okay, let's continue. Yeah, so I was just tired, tired of inconsequential racial equity lip service to placate global majority communities. We have the Equality Act here in the UK, which says racism is illegal, and it means that UK law is not being upheld when racism takes place. Yeah? I think this is a very important quote over here. If you celebrate the diversity but ignore the disparity, then that's hypocrisy, to say the least. Yes? So we must voice such incidents to combat racial bigotry rather than being silent about them. And these memoir polemics on race, these life-writing examples on race are great examples of that, but they are primarily London-centric. They are, okay? So I do believe there needs to be a broader net cast beyond the capital, particularly in isolated Scotland, considering Scotland has the least percentage of global majority communities in the UK, and yet the highest murder rate, right? So yeah, that's part of why I created the Scottish Racism Project, to bring that to the fore, but also decided to write this Stained Glass Eyes memoir polemic to expose racism, because when you insulate all the cerebral thinking, kind of academic content with kind of more sensory feeling, creative memoir content, it becomes more relatable. And that's better to drive social change towards ethical parity. Here's the thing, mind you. See that mask? Oddly enough, I still had self-censorship. Self-censorship was still kind of tempering my own gumption in the writing of this of this narrative, yeah? So it's kind of tentatively changing all the more controversial truths of being, targeted for murder as a primary school student into red font for later omission from my manuscript. I was still doing that. Soon half the manuscript was in red to be omitted later. So my text color coding was pandering to the same white fragility from my school days, kind of muffled foundations, yes? In the same way they had tried to silence me during school, I was now silencing myself. What on earth? Nah, mate. Nah, mate. No. These stories encapsulating the plight of black people should all be in black font. Yes, it should. The controversy held within being the audacity of racism, not the audacity of me to voice it. Yes. And that's also very much infused in Renee Ediloge's book title, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Yes? Because she always encountered that fragility. But now she's always talking to white people about race, so good on you, Ren. Lovely jubbly. So I do indeed dare to be powerful with candid words, joining other voices as acts of resistance against racism through my upcoming memoir, Polemic Stained Glass Eyes. Yes, racists want to keep us down. They want to keep us silent. We will not be kept down or silent. No. We will raise our global voices and demand change on Scottish and wider British shores. Absolutely. So like these other life writers and change makers on race, watch this space to hear me under the silence. Absolutely. These are my sources for some of the content, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you very much.
Morning, everyone. It's an interesting experience for me being here, having retired a number of years ago. This feels like a generational jump for me, all these incredibly young faces around me. It's also the first time in my little life that I've given a 15-minute presentation, so I'm very anxious about time today. I'll try not to make a mess of it. I'm grateful to the conference organisers for the space to speak to you about Palestine. For me, it's a marker of what a great conference this is, that for once I'm not the only person talking about Palestine. We've got our excellent keynote speaker after lunch, and I'm devastated to learn that she's not actually going to be here, so it's going to be a video link. But it's a marker for me of how important Palestine is. Patricia, in her introduction to today, mentioned a whole series of anniversaries, and I just want to add in a couple more. This year is the 75th anniversary of what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe visited on them by the creation of the State of Israel. This year is also the 20th anniversary of the poem that I'm going to be talking about. To me, it's incredibly important to talk to anybody about Palestine. My wife wishes I would shut up about it. Palestine is arguably one of the greatest ethical and political scandals of the last 3/4 of a century. It's a situation that requires radical treatment, and none is forthcoming. So in that space, we do what we can. Mahmoud Darwish, if you don't know him, I'm sure many of you will, arguably the greatest poet writing in Arabic in the last 3/4 of a century. Friend of Edward Said, occasional speechwriter for Yasser Arafat, translated into 25 languages, should have had the Nobel Prize for Literature several times over, never quite got it. That's what happens when you're Palestinian. State of Siege was Darwish's response in poetry to being under siege again. He was in Beirut through the Israeli siege in the 1980s. This time he was in Ramallah when the Israelis launched Operation Defensive Shield, and Darwish woke up to find an Israeli tank parked outside his bedroom window. He'd been trying to give up immediate responses in poetry to historic moments, but felt that this was one time he had to say something. So, at great speed and able only to look at a few sections of the poem, this, in some ways, is the context of the poem. For those of you who can't see behind you, in spite of a minor disturbance, the myths won't give an inch. Ships may run aground on a land without a people. Fantasy and reality may get muddled up, but the plots won't budge. Our facts on the ground are bulldozed away, but truth will walk naked one day. Lots in there. What the poem is voicing at one level is the struggle for truth on the part of the Palestinians, and what they're struggling against is a history of Israeli ideology, myths, and straight barefaced lies. A couple of things in there. Ships may run aground on a land without a people. Many of you will be familiar with the classic Zionist tagline of a land without a people for a people without a land. The Jews at the end of the 19th century wanted a homeland, and Palestine was deemed to be a land without a people, or at least a people that weren't worth mentioning. Facts on the ground, classic phrase used by the Israeli government when they set up new illegal settlements and people said, this is illegal, take them away. Oh, no, these are facts on the ground now. What Darwish is saying is that our facts on the ground are bulldozed away. So Palestinian reality is routinely flattened by Israeli bulldozers built by JCB and the Caterpillar company. But truth will walk naked one day. We've got what Darwish would class as one of his Trojan epics. In the 1980s, he began writing poetry which aimed to give voice to the silenced and marginalized and simply removed groups in history. So we know all about the Greeks in the Trojan War. We have no idea what the Trojans thought or what they might have written. So Darwish began a series of epic poems for those whose voices had been erased from history. And these ranged from the Muslims in the Kingdom of Granada facing the Reconquista in 1492, through to indigenous people in North America being wiped out by the white man. This poem is the first time that Darwish has focused on his own people in one of his extensive epics, which is interesting in itself. Opening stanza here on the slopes facing the sunset and the cannon mouth of time, near ripped-up orchards stripped of their shadows, we do what prisoners do, we do what the unemployed do, we cultivate hope. And this is a kind of encapsulation of what we, the Palestinians, are up against. Death, destruction, incarceration, poverty. Despite that, we cultivate hope. It's an important theme through the poem. We haven't got time to follow it, but it's important because it's a different kind of hope. It's not wishy-washy or it'll be all right one day. Some of you may know the work of the great Ernst Bloch, Marxist philosopher. His epic 3-volume Das Prinzip Hoffnung, the principle of hope. Bloch invites us to think about hope as something much more embodied, something much more practical, something much more critical, something much more political. And that's the kind of sense that Darwish is working towards. A different vision of hope here. Hope is an incurable malady. One of the important things in the poem, and it's a theme I'll follow through, is the idea of humanity. And the voices speaking in the poem give voice to that humanity. And it's interesting that there are 15 or 16 different voices in the poem, which is very unusual, even for a poem of a certain length. And one of the tasks is fighting Israeli myths about Palestinians and their lack of humanity. And against that, the poem offers a whole range of instances of inclusion, of highlighting similarity between Israelis and Palestinians, and above all, asserting common humanity. And this is one of the voices in the poem. Hey, you, on the doorstep, come in and drink Arab coffee with us. Then maybe you'll feel you're human like us. You on the doorstep, please get out of our mornings. Then maybe we'll feel we are human like you. The complexities, the contradictions, but amazingly, the difficulty of articulating humanity. I'll skip that second one, you can work it out for yourself. One of the much commented on aspects of Palestinian resistance, which is based on humanity, is the idea of sumud, S-U-M-U-D. And the third piece there is that sumud is basically resolute refusal to give in. We stand here, we sit here, we are here, we're always here with one aim in life, just to be. Apart from that, we disagree about everything. Uh-oh. The technology wants me to quit sooner than... I've had a 5-minute warning. Okay. One of the aspects of our common humanity is much commented on by Judith Butler in her books, the Power of... I lost the title. Power of Nonviolence and Precarious Lives. And the idea of grievability. And so in order to qualify as a proper human being, your life has to be grievable. And Butler says, for if a life is not grievable, it's not quite a life. It doesn't qualify as a life and is not worth a note. It's already the unburied, if not the unburyable. Palestinians are routinely deemed non-grievable. Mainstream media news highlights again and again loss of Israeli life, Yesterday, 4 Israelis were killed in a petrol station by 2 Palestinian assailants. This was Hamas's response to the Israeli attack on Jenin at the end of last week, which didn't make the mainstream media. So 1 bunch of deaths, and obviously more Palestinians killed, 1 bunch of deaths isn't mentioned, it isn't grieved, another bunch. So part of the resistance in the poem is to grieve and to assert the grievability of Palestinian lives. 2 examples there. Second one, very lyrical. The first one, almost matter of fact. The mother said, "I never noticed him wet with his own blood. I never noticed the blood on the floor. He leaned against the wall, drinking chamomile tea, planning what to do tomorrow." And the repetition of sentiments of grief is a marker of the loss of Palestinian life, but also how those lives deserve to be remembered and grieved. Okay, this one, which I'll jump through, is about similarities between Israelis and Palestinians. What I want to move on to, another of the myths about Palestinians is that they have no history, they have no culture. And through the poem, there are a load of examples that resist those lies. Top one, to poetry, besiege your siege. This actually is a quote, is Darwish quoting himself from something he wrote in the Siege of Beirut. But also, it obviously demonstrates a faith in the power of poetry, the power of speaking through poetry. Second one, when I write 20 lines about love, I imagine this siege has gone back 20 meters. So for Darwish, even love poetry has the power to push back the Israeli siege. And Darwish famously said, if they'd left me alone, I wouldn't write about politics, I'd be a love poet. Last one is interesting. The idea this siege will endure runs through the whole poem. Here it's important. This siege will endure until we can teach our enemies odes of our Canaanite poetry. What it's saying is Palestinians have something to teach Israelis. Yeah? They can teach them about their culture. They have a reservoir, or a rich reservoir of poetry. But the key word there is Canaanite, because of course the Canaanites were in the Holy Land before the Jews arrived. So we were here first. We have a rich reservoir of poetry. Na 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 na. And finally, a truce, so we can see if it's really true that fighter planes can be beaten into ploughshares. We begged for a truce, just to test the waters, just to see if peace could seep back into the bloodstream, just so we could fight our battles with poetry for once. But they told us, haven't you heard that peace begins at home? What happens if your music brings our high walls tumbling down? And we answered, so what's wrong with that? Why not? Just a couple of things to pick up from that. Fighter planes beaten into ploughshares, obviously an echo of the Bible, swords beaten into ploughshares. The idea of fighting our battles with poetry for once, obviously a different approach to warfare. Darwish was very sure that if the Israelis and Palestinians fought their battles with poetry, Palestine would win hands down. Very sure about that. Also, what happens if your music brings our high walls tumbling down? Again, an echo of the Bible. Famously, the prophet Joshua besieging the city of Jericho. They like doing sieges, don't they? The walls of Jericho were brought tumbling down by the trumpets of the Jews. And we answered, so what's wrong with that? Why not? Why not indeed? Thank you.
Before I begin, I just want to break the ice and say I am an obvious American and I talk like an American. So, if you hear me say y'all, slay, etc., just go with it. Today I'm here to talk about the power that stems from vulnerability and the space we all need to make for Black women to feel vulnerable. This is called Bad Bitches Have Bad Days Too, which is based on a line from a song by Megan Thee Stallion called Anxiety. Society tends to box people into stereotypes, which is particularly true for Black women, who are quickly forced into a unidimensional schema of super or subhuman, and therefore deserving or specially equipped to handle misogynoir. By the way, misogynoir is a unique layering of violence that Black women face. It is neither merely racism nor merely patriarchy, but it is the compounding factors of both intermingling. That term is coined by Moyo Bailey, by the way. These schemes of misogynoir can be seen in various stereotypes of Black women: the sassy Black woman, the hypersexual Black woman, the angry Black woman, and the strong Black woman, just to name a few. Narratives of vulnerability can help challenge these schemas because they humanize Black women. Specifically, I'm going to analyze my all-time favorite musical artist, Megan Thee Stallion, and her vulnerability, mid-rhetorical and physical attacks on her, which adds nuance to the narrative of the strong Black woman, rather than outright rejecting it. I argue that Megan's vulnerability adds to the traditional narrative of strength, helping alleviate the dangers of the strong Black woman schema. This will include a timeline of events from the shooting of Megan Thee Stallion in the summer of 2020 through her 2022 performance hosting Saturday Night Live, an analysis of the events from the shooting to the SNL hosting, and an in-depth analysis of her performance of Anxiety on Saturday Night Live. So first, what is the strong Black woman schema? The strong Black woman schema has origins in biological racism, where Black women were portrayed as more deserving and able to handle extreme conditions. Black women would be expected to do the same work for their families, on top of work and on top of caring for their white slave masters, with no pay, by the way, because they were slaves. White people would justify severe conditions with arguments of Black people having little to no pain perception or being able to tolerate mental distress better than other races because of their either not competent enough or because they are more able to take on those burdens. Many doctors to this day still believe that Black people have a higher pain tolerance than other races, despite this being patently false. The belief that Black women are inherently more resilient has continued to be used to justify the mistreatment of Black women and girls. One way this starts post-antebellum slavery is the adultification of Black girls. Black girls are 6 times more likely to face out-of-school suspensions than their white peers in the US. They are less likely to be seen as needing nurturing or protection. They are believed to be more knowledgeable about sex than their white peers. And the culmination of these beliefs has created the strong Black woman schema, characterized by emotional restraint, independence, and caretaking. Strength serves as a way to distance oneself from the consequences of one's oppression, and don't get me wrong, it has its benefits. While labeling oneself as strong can be empowering, it becomes a liability when it's the only option, though. The coping mechanism of seeing oneself as strong is sometimes helpful, but can be problematic for multiple reasons. People use the strength of Black women to justify their mistreatment because they can handle it when they can't. Black women can also avoid seeking physical and mental health for fear of being seen as weak, which is why statistically we see Black women less likely to go to primary care and more likely to have long-term health struggles, also compounded by the stress and trauma of living through an anti-Black world. Black women are encouraged to be caretakers for those around them, particularly family. They're encouraged to be calm and in control at all times and never need help from anyone under this schema. This is an impossible standard to maintain at all times for anyone. As a result, Black women have higher rates of depression, anxiety, other mental effects, heart conditions, and more. In addition to justifying the maltreatment and creating health complications for Black women, the Strong Black Women schema forces Black women into situations that result in their vilification because they're merely serving as a protector. Being strong in the face of adversity is often unfairly criticized as too angry or too masculine. Now, vulnerability as a complication to the Strong Black Woman schema. Vulnerability challenges the parts of a Strong Black Woman schema that encourage suppression of emotion by displaying strength. Many have criticized vulnerability as a tool for privileged white women, and I get it, there's many criticisms of Brene Brown. This is not gonna be a heavy Brene Brown lecture, don't worry. However, it is also the very vulnerability of Black women that makes them so strong, as seen by many Black women considering their vulnerability a key part of their strength. For example, Brescia Wade argues that vulnerability is in fact the rawest form of power that Black women have. Vulnerability is the impetus for productive use of power, and Black women demonstrate this daily. In this way, showing weakness is strong because of the bravery required to do it. Furthermore, practicing vulnerability is an act that challenges shame, a core tool of white supremacy. I know I said no Brene Brown, but I'm going to quote her once. Brene Brown argues that when it comes to shame, the less you speak about it, the more you have. Bell Hooks then says, one of the ways racism colonizes the minds and imaginations of Black people is through systemic shaming. So practicing vulnerability, showing weakness, but still believing yourself to be enough can challenge that anti-Black shame. One can't challenge anti-Black racism without challenging the white supremacist tool of shame. And as famously said earlier, one can't challenge shame coming from shame because the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde further reminds one that silence is no protection. Lorde argues there is nothing to lose as Black women are already at risk of death constantly. This is especially brought to light when she wrote, and that visibility which makes us the most vulnerable is that which also is the source of our greatest strength, because the machine will try to grind you into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. It reminds me of a great line from an amazing book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, that if you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. At the same time, vulnerability is a double-edged sword in response to the double-edged sword of the Strong Black Woman schema, which is to say it's important to recognize the very real risk that comes with vulnerability. With that being larger for Black women, sharing your story is always scary, and it's harder when your story is even scarier. Now, who is Meg? Megan Thee Stallion is an amazing rapper and an icon in America. Inspired by her mother's music career, Megan Thee Stallion rose to fame in the late 2010s after her third EP, Tina Snow, and one of its singles, Big Ol' Freak, began charting in 2018. Known for her confident style and hypersexual lyrics, Megan Thee Stallion quickly became a talking point for right-wing pundits. Her song with Cardi B, WAP, which you all know what it stands for, instantly went viral and became a summer hit, even in a pandemic. Meg then had Beyoncé on a remix of her song Savage, which culminated in multiple Grammys. As the daughter of a single mother that also rapped, Megan went into studio sessions throughout her childhood. Her mom, Holly Thomas, served as a role model, an example of a strong Black woman. Megan said of her mother, "Like now I'm understanding you got a lot on you. It's a lot of pressure, but you're not saying it to nobody. I know it's probably just hard to be a single mama trying to take care of yourself and your daughter, and you're putting on a face. You're acting like everything is okay just so I feel comfortable. I feel like a lot of Black girls learn that early. I did. I do that a lot." This reflection shows Megan struggles with the pressure to be a strong Black woman, as many young Black girls do from a young age. I'm now going to go over a brief timeline of events before I do an analysis of Megan's performance. So in July of 2020, Megan Thee Stallion was shot in the feet after exiting an SUV mid-transit from a party. At the time, fellow rapper Tory Lanez was charged with possession of a concealed weapon, but no other charges were filed. I'm just going to pause a second. No worries. TMZ, a few days later, reported that Lanez was the alleged shooter, leading to mass speculation online of if there was a shooting at all and who the shooter was if there was one. In August, Meg finally broke her silence and named Lanez as the shooter. There's a slight typo on here. You can see November comes first, but I'm going to organize it properly. That September, Tory Lanez released an album with multiple references to the allegations. In October, Meg was the musical guest on Saturday Night Live, sending a Protect Black Women message. It was followed by an op-ed in the New York Times by Meg. A few days later, Lanes was arrested on charges of assault with a semi-automatic firearm and carrying a loaded, unregistered firearm in the vehicle. That November, Meg also released an album speaking on the issue. Meg stayed out of the public eye for a few years, but did an interview on CBS Morning, which is national news in America, about the shooting in 2022. That August, Meg released her sophomore album, once again speaking on the shooting and the ongoing case in court. In October, Meg was once again on Saturday Night Live, this time as the host and musical guest. All right, becoming Megan the Vulnerable, or the Vulnerable, if you will. When Megan was shot, the cops arrived, but Megan lied to protect her shooter out of fear of police brutality, saying her feet were merely cut. It should be noted that this was the summer of 2020 and was filled with protests of police violence that faced various levels of crackdown from the police, heightening Megan's fear of police interactions, as she later stated in her interview on CBS. This protection of the shooter over herself would later fuel online defender of Tory Lanez's claims that she was never shot. The media campaign against Megan Thee Stallion ramped up once she named her shooter. This can be seen in the release of the album Daystar by Tory Lanez. The song Money Over Fallouts directly accuses Megan of lying about being shot with the lyrics, "How the fuck you get shot in your foot, don't hit no bones or tendons," which, by the way, is not even a good lyrical line. More jabs at Meg can be seen in the music videos for Broke Leg and Cap, where Broke Leg features dancers with crutches as props in a reference to her foot injuries. Cap features Lanes literally chopping up horse legs with machetes, which is an even obvious dig to Megan, a rapper named after a horse type. The album Good News by Megan Thee Stallion allowed her to tell her side of the story, and at this point, she's embodying the traditional strong black woman schema still. The opening song, Shots Fired, is a direct reference to the physical and rhetorical shots being taken at Megan over the past months. The song draws a parallel between the violence Megan Thee Stallion faced and the violence that Breonna Taylor faced from the Louisville police. For those unaware, Breonna Taylor was an American woman who was shot in her apartment by the police who were using an incorrect no-knock warrant. On the first time being the musical guest on Saturday Night Live was the performance of her song Savage. It was politically charged, starting with a backdrop that read, "Protect Black Woman," in all caps. The middle of the song was interrupted by gunshot noises and bullet holes appearing on the digital backdrop, with a famous audio from Malcolm X. The most disrespected, unprotected, neglected person in America is the black woman. Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair, the color of your skin, the shape of your nose? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head, from the soles of your feet? This was followed with a recent, at the time, audio from actress Tamika Mallory criticizing the Kentucky Attorney General David Cameron for failing to file charges against the police who murdered Breonna Taylor in her home. After, Megan added her own words. "We need to protect our black women and loved our black women, because at the end of the day, we need our black women. We need to protect our black men and stand up for our black men, because at the end of the day, we're tired of seeing hashtags about our black men." This performance of Megan's was more vulnerable, but still projected power. The message was pro-black woman, but it shifted its messaging to the need to protect black women. The op-ed released a few days later in New York Times further advanced a more vulnerable side of Megan. Echoing her sentiment from her performance on Saturday Night Live, Meg discussed the misogynoir that black women face. Citing her shooting, violence against other women, police brutality, and the election, Meg wrote about being met with skepticism and judgment, speaking directly on the public's vilification of her. The article furthers the dive into Megan's vulnerable side, sharing details of her personal and life struggle. The interview with Gayle King becomes incredibly emotional. Meg is on the brink of tears and sheds a few at times while discussing the fear she felt for her life. Meg is putting her vulnerability on full display here, not focusing on putting on a strong face. The release of her album Traumazine properly introduced the listeners to Megan's version of the strong black woman schema. The title of the album, as Meg put it, refers to the fictional chemical that is released in your brain when you're forced to deal with painful emotions caused by traumatic events and experiences. Rapping about the loss of her mother, depression, anxiety, and other vulnerable topics, Megan exposes herself to the world like never before. That being said, the album does not shy from being both vulnerable and strong. Many songs convey confidence, strength, joy, independence, and anger, but they're intermingled with softer sides of Megan, showing that there are layers to black women despite what the strong black schema would have one believe. She doesn't reject her strength, she's strong and vulnerable. Her weakness doesn't define her, but rather serves to humanize her. This humanization comes from a lack of shame around the details of her life that are difficult for anyone to talk about, let alone a celebrity under the media eye. When Megan Thee Stallion hosted Saturday Night Live and was the musical guest, she did a performance of the song Anxiety. That performance continued Megan's challenge of the rigid definitions of the strong black woman. Megan Thee Stallion, sorry, I lost my place, speaks about being vulnerable and wanting support and fearing showing too much vulnerability. Right off the bat, she starts by saying, I'm a bad bitch and I got bad anxiety, letting the world know that being a bad bitch doesn't require perfection. A few lines later, Meg says, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, bad bitches have days, bad days too. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, bounce back, how a bad bitch always do. Showing that resiliency and having a bad moment are not in contradiction with each other. This is finally tempered with a theme of the cost of vulnerability. This can be seen visually from the pageant-style costumes and the backup dancer sashes that can be heard in her lyrics about not being believed and other celebrities who face trauma. The backup dancers were all black women wearing silver and pink evening gowns with sashes labeling them misunderpaid, misoverworked, misoverwhelmed, misunderlooked, and misinsecure. These are common ways that black women are mistreated by society and forcing them to be strong black women. When they report, sorry, I skipped a line. They keep saying speak your mind and at the same time say they don't believe. That line points out the double standards that black women face. Black women aren't believed when they report pain. When they report intimate partner violence, or when they're simply trying to live their lives in a predominantly white neighborhood. This is especially true for Megan, who faced a slew of memes about being shot by Tory Lanez. I know I'm a little bit over, but I have just 2 sentences left. Megan's performance of Anxiety and the events leading up to it continue to complicate what it means to be a strong black woman, and if black women should strive for it. The backlash she faced leading up to her performance shows that even strong black women can be attacked and taken down by the media, making vulnerability a risk worth taking for many. More importantly, us non-black people need to make space for black women to be vulnerable. The onus can't only be on black women to challenge this schema, as that further perpetuates the strong black woman schema itself. So rather than daring black women to be stronger, I dare everyone else to empower black women to feel safe enough to be vulnerable.